The Shadow of Mount Gundabad, A War in the North. Chapter 1. The Embers of Ancient Wrath. In the gray twilight of the Third Age, when the power of the elves waned and the dominion of men grew ever stronger, there stirred in the frozen wastes beyond the misty mountain a darkness that had slumbered since the fall of Angband. The bitter winds that swept down from Mount Gundabad carried with them whispers of an ancient malice, and the hardy folk of Rudor felt the chill of more than winter in their bone. Thranduil, king of the woodland realm, stood upon the highest tower of his halls, his keen eyes piercing the gloom that gathered in the north. The trees spoke to him of shadows moving where no shadows should be, of the very stones crying out in anguish. The Elven King's heart was heavy, for he remembered the wars of old, when his father Orifer had fallen beneath the slopes of Mount Doom, and he knew that such darkness as now stirred would not be easily quenched. In the ruins of Fornost, where once the kings of Arthedain had held court, a ranger named Aldanor made his way through the crumbling hall. His weathered face bore the marks of countless leagues traveled in service to the hidden kingdom of Arnor, and his gray eyes held the wisdom of one who had walked long in the wild. Upon his breast he bore the star of the Dunedain, and at his side hung the sword of his father, its blade keen and bright despite the years. The ranger paused before a shattered throne, where winter's frost had claimed the royal seat of the North Kingdom. Here, in this desolate place, he had been summoned by signs and portents that spoke of a gathering storm. The very air seemed to thicken with foreboding, and Aldanor's keen senses detected the acrid scent of orc fires carried on the northern wind. Far to the east, in the blue mountains where the dwarves of Belegost had once delved deep, Thorek Ironbeard struck his hammer against the anvil with renewed fury. The son of Telchar's line, he had felt the trembling of the earth beneath his feet, the groaning of stone that spoke of ancient evils stirring. His people had long guarded the passes of the Blue Mountain, but now whispers came from the gray mountains of orcs, massing in numbers not seen since the War of the Last Alliance. The Dwarf Lord's hall was filled with the sound of steel being forged anew, for his smiths worked day and night to prepare for the war that all could feel approaching. The ancient grudges against the goblin kind burned bright in Thorek's heart, and he knew that the time of reckoning had come at last. In the depths of Mount Gundabad, where the orcs claimed their first dominion in the ancient days, a shadow took shape that had not walked Middle-earth for long centuries. Bolg the Terrible, spawn of Azog the Defiler, had awakened from his long slumber in the deep places of the earth. His yellow eyes blazed with malice as he surveyed the vast host that had gathered at his call. Orcs of the mountain, wargs of the wild, and creatures of darkness that had bred in the sunless depths. The time of hiding was over. The north would burn, and from its ashes would rise an empire of shadow that would sweep south like a plague, consuming all in its path. The ancient hatred of his kind would at last find its fullest expression, and the free peoples would learn to fear the darkness that had always dwelt in the roots of the mountain. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. The first snows of winter fell heavy upon the lands of Rudor, but they brought no peace to the troubled realm. From the Etten Moors came reports of strange lights dancing in the sky, and the hill folk whispered of drums beating in the deep places of the earth. The few scattered settlements that remained in that desolate land began to send their people south, for the very stone seemed to whisper of approaching doom. Aldanor rode swift as the wind through the lone lands, his horse's hooves striking sparks from the frozen ground. Behind him rode 12 of his kindred, rangers all, their faces grim beneath their weathered hoods. They had answered the call that had gone out from the Angle, where the chieftain of the Dunedain held court in secret, and each bore news more dire than the last. The orcs move in great numbers, spoke Halaton, eldest of the rangers, his voice barely above a whisper. They pour down from the passes of the misty mountains like a black tide, and their drums echo in the night. The villages of the Trollshaws have fallen silent, and smoke rises from the ruins of Rivendell's outer defenses. Aldanor's jaw tightened at these words, for he had long hoped that the realm of Elrond would remain inviolate against the growing darkness. If even the hidden valley was threatened, then the peril was greater than any had imagined. In the halls of the Elven King, messengers arrived bearing tidings chilled the heart. The wood elves of Mirkwood had long held their realm against the darkness of Dol Guldur, but now a new threat arose from the north. The spiders of the great forest grew bold and numerous, and the paths through the woodland became treacherous with shadows that moved with purpose and malice. Legolas, prince of the woodland realm, stood before his father's throne, his fair face marked with concern. "The darkness spreads," he said, using the Elvish word for father. "Our patrols report that the very trees begin to whisper of ancient fears. The necromancer's influence grows stronger, and I fear that this new threat from the north may be connected to the shadow that we have long fought in the south." Thranduil's eyes were distant as he gazed into the flames of the great hearth. "Long have we held the line against the darkness of Dol Guldur," he murmured. "But if the ancient evil of Mount Gundabad has awakened, then we face a war on two fronts that may test even our strength. Send word to Lord Elrond. The time for councils has come." In the halls beneath the Blue Mountains, the sound of war horns echoed through the deep places. Thorak Ironbeard had called upon the scattered clans of his people, and they came forth from their hidden halls with axe and hammer gleaming. The dwarves of Belagost, the Firebeards of the eastern slopes, and even some of the Broadbeams from the distant Iron Hills answered the call, for the ancient oaths of their people bound them to stand against the darkness. "Too long have we dwelt in the shadows of our former glory," Thorak declared to the assembled host. "The time has come to reclaim our birthright and drive the orc spawn back to the pits from whence they came. Let the mountains ring with our war cries, and let our enemies learn once more why the name of Durin's folk is feared throughout Middle-earth." The Dwarf Lord's words were met with a great roar of approval, and the sound of axes striking shields echoed through the halls like thunder. The fire of battle burned bright in the eyes of the dwarves, and they prepared for war with the grim determination of their people. But in the depths of Mount Gundabad, Bolg the Terrible smiled with cruel satisfaction as he surveyed his growing host. The ancient fortress had been awakened from its long slumber, and now it swarmed with the servants of darkness. Orcs beyond counting filled the great halls, their harsh voices raised in songs of war and destruction. Wargs howled in the courtyards, their red eyes gleaming with hunger for battle. Yet it was not orcs and wargs alone that answered Bolg's call. From the gray mountains came the goblins of the deep places, pale and vicious creatures that had never seen the light of the sun. From the northern waste came the cold drakes, lesser dragons that had survived the fall of their great kindred, their breath bringing death and despair to all who stood against them. The time of the final war had come, and the fate of the North hung in the balance. Chapter 3. The Council of the Wise. The Hall of Fire in Rivendell had seen many councils throughout the long years of the Third Age, but none perhaps so grave as that which convened in the dying days of autumn. The great chamber was filled with the representatives of the free peoples, their faces reflecting the weight of the tidings they bore. Lord Elrond, master of the last homely house, presided over the assembly with the wisdom of aged, his gray eyes heavy with the burden of foreknowledge. At his right hand sat Gandalf the Grey, the wizard's weathered face grave with concern. The staff of power rested against his chair, and his keen eyes surveyed the assembled company with the intensity of one who has seen the shadow of doom gathering in the distance. Beside him stood Radagast the Brown, his wild hair matted with leaves and his cloak stained with the earth of the wild places, for he had come in haste from the depths of Mirkwood with news of the growing darkness. "The shadow spreads from two sources," Gandalf spoke, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "From Dol Guldur in the south, the necromancer's influence grows ever stronger. But now, from the north, comes a new threat that may prove even more dire. The ancient evil of Mount Gundabad has awakened, and Bolg the Terrible walks once more in Middle-earth." A murmur of dismay ran through the assembly, for the name of Bolg was not unknown to the wise. Thranduil's face grew stern, and his hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword. "I had hoped that Spawn of Azog had perished in the depths of the earth," he said. "His return bodes ill for all the free peoples." Aldenor rose from his place among the rangers, his travel-stained cloak marking him as one who had ridden far to reach this council. "My lord," he said, bowing to Elrond, "the Dunedain have long watched the borders of the north, and I bring word that the enemy moves with purpose and design. This is no mere raiding party of orcs, but a host gathered for conquest. The drums of war echo from the misty mountains to the gray mountains, and the very stones cry out in warning." Thorek Ironbeard, his axe laid across his knees, growled in agreement. "The Dwarf Lord speaks truth," he said. "My people have felt the trembling of the earth, and our scouts report great movements in the orc holds of the north. They come not as raiders, but as conquerors, and their numbers are beyond counting." Elrond nodded gravely, his fingers steepled before him. "Then we must act with all speed," he said. "The time for watching and waiting has passed. If we do not unite now against this threat, then the darkness will sweep over the north like a flood, and all our realms will fall one by one." Legolas, who had remained silent throughout the proceeding, now spoke with the clear voice of his kindred. "The Woodland Realm will stand with the free people," he declared, "but we face a war on two fronts. For the darkness of Dol Guldur presses us from the south, even as this new threat emerges from the north. We cannot abandon our vigil against the necromancer, lest his forces break free while we battle in the distant mountain. Nor can we ignore the threat from Mount Gundabad," added Aldenor. "The rangers are few, and the remnants of Arnor cannot stand alone against such a host. We need the strength of all the free people if we are to have any hope of victory." Gandalf rose from his seat, his staff gleaming in the firelight. "There is wisdom in your word," he said. "But know this, the two threats are not separate, but part of a greater design. The Necromancer and Bolg the Terrible serve the same master, though they may not know it. The Dark Lord stirs in Mordor, and his influence reaches out to all the servants of Shadow." The revelation sent a chill through the assembly, for if the wizard spoke true, then they faced not merely a war in the north, but the first stirrings of a greater conflict that would engulf all Middle-earth. The weight of this knowledge settled upon them like a shroud, and for a moment the Hall of Fire was silent, save for the crackling of the flames. But it was Thorek who broke the silence, his voice ringing with the determination of his people. "Then we fight," he said simply. "Whatever the cost, whatever the odds, we fight. The dwarves have faced the darkness before, and we shall face it again. Let Bolg and his spawn come. They will find that the axes of Durin's folk are still sharp, and our resolve is unbroken." His words stirred the hearts of all present, and one by one, the representatives of the free peoples pledged their strength to the coming war. The elves would hold the line in the south, while sending what aid they could to the north. The rangers would watch the borders and strike at the enemy's flanks. The dwarves would march to war with all their might, their ancient hatred of the orc kind burning bright in their hearts. As the council drew to a close, Elrond stood and raised his hand in blessing. "Go now to your people," he said. "Prepare for war, but do not despair. The darkness is great, but it is not yet victorious. The light of the Eldar still shines in Middle-earth, and while it endures, hope remains." But even as the words of encouragement were spoken, a shadow seemed to fall across the hall, and those with the gift of foresight felt a chill that spoke of trials yet to come. Chapter 4. The First Battle. The first light of dawn had barely touched the peaks of the misty mountains when the war horns of the enemy echoed across the valleys. From the heights of Mount Gundabad, Bolg the Terrible gazed down upon the armies of the free peoples with eyes that burned like coals in the darkness. His host was vast beyond reckoning, orcs in their thousands, wargs howling for blood, and creatures of shadow that had not walked under the sun for long ages. In the valley below, the forces of the north had gathered in desperate alliance. The rangers of the Dunedain stood in their weathered cloaks, their swords gleaming in the morning light. Beside them, the dwarves of the Blue Mountains formed ranks of steel and stone, their axes keen and their shields polished bright. From the woodland realm had come a company of elves, their armor shining like silver, their bows strung and ready. Aldanor stood at the fore of the ranger, his gray eyes scanning the enemy lines with the practiced gaze of one who had fought in many battles. The star of the Dunedain gleamed upon his breast, and at his side hung the sword of his fathers, its blade singing softly in the morning air. Behind him, his kinsmen waited in grim silence, their faces set with the determination of those who fight for more than victory. They fought for the very survival of their people. Thorek Ironbeard raised his warhammer high, its head gleaming with runes of power. "Today we settle the ancient debt," he cried to his warriors. "Today the orc spawn learn why the name of Durin's folk is feared throughout Middle-earth." The dwarves roared their approval, their voices echoing from the mountainsides like thunder. From the elven ranks came the clear voice of Galeon, captain of the Woodland Guard, who had led his warriors far from the halls of Thranduil. "Let your arrows fly true, my kinsmen," he called. "Let the darkness learn that the light of the Eldar is not yet dimmed." The elves drew their bows in unison, the sound like the sighing of wind through leaves. But even as the free peoples prepared for battle, the shadow of Mount Gundabad fell across the valley, and from its depths came sounds that chilled the heart. The drums of war beat like the pulse of some great and terrible heart, and the very air seemed to grow thick with malice. Then, with a roar that shook the very foundations of the mountains, Bolg the Terrible led his host into battle. The orcs poured down from the heights like a black tide, their weapons glinting the pale light, their voices raised in songs of slaughter. Behind them came the ward, their red eyes gleaming with hunger, and overhead the shapes of fell beasts darkened the sky. The battle was joined with a clash that echoed across the northern land. The rangers fought with the skill of the Dunedain, their swords flickering like flames as they cut through the orc rank. The dwarves stood like a wall of stone, their axes rising and falling with deadly precision. The elves' arrows sang through the air, each shaft finding its mark with the unerring aim of the firstborn. But the enemy was vast in number, and for every orc that fell, two more seemed to take its place. The battle raged from dawn to dusk, the very earth stained with blood, and still the tide of darkness pressed forward. It was then that Aldanor saw the truth that chilled his heart. This was no mere battle, but a trap. The main body of Bolg's host had not yet entered the fray. They waited in the shadows of the mountains, ready to fall upon the free peoples when they were exhausted by the fight. The rangers' eyes met those of Thorek across the battlefield, and in that moment, both warriors understood the peril they faced. "Fall back!" Aldanor cried, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "This is a trap. We must withdraw before we are surrounded." But even as the words left his lips, the trap was sprung. From the hidden paths of the mountains came the true host of Bolg, their numbers darkening the sky like a storm cloud. The free peoples found themselves surrounded, their retreat cut off by walls of orc steel and wargfang. In that desperate hour, it seemed that all hope was lost. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and the light of the free peoples flickered like a candle in the wind. Yet still they fought, for they knew that this battle would determine the fate of the North, and perhaps of all Middle-earth. The sun set blood-red behind the mountain, and the battle raged on into the night, lit only by the fires of war and the glimmer of starlight on steel. The fate of the North hung in the balance, and the darkness pressed ever closer. Chapter 5. The Retreat to Weathertop. The bitter wind that swept across the Weather Hills carried with it the acrid scent of smoke and the echo of distant drum. Upon the ancient watchtower of Weathertop, the remnants of the northern host had made their stand, the great stone pinnacle rising like a defiant finger against the darkening sky. The battle in the valley had been lost, but not without cost to the enemy, and now the survivors of that grim encounter prepared for what might be their final stand. Aldanor stood atop the ruined tower, his weathered face etched with lines of weariness and pain. A crude bandage covered a wound upon his brow, and his sword arm hung heavy at his side. Yet his gray eyes remained keen as he surveyed the approaches to Weathertop, watching for signs of the enemy's advance. Behind him, the rangers of the Dunedain tended to their wound and counted their arrows, their faces grim with the knowledge of what was to come. "How many?" he asked of Halatin, the eldest of the rangers, who had been making the tally of their remaining strength. 63 rangers still bear arms," came the reply. "The dwarves number 47, and the elves but 22. We are few, kinsmen, but we are not yet defeated." Thorek Ironbeard sat upon a broken stone, his mighty warhammer resting across his knee. The dwarf lord's armor was dented and stained with battle, but his eyes still burned with the fire of his people's ancient rage. "Let them come," he growled. "We have made them pay dear for their victory, and we shall make them pay dearer still before the end." From the shadows of the tower's broken walls came Galeon, the elven captain, his silver mail dulled with dust and blood. "The enemy masses in the valley below," he reported. "Their numbers are beyond counting, and they prepare for the final assault. Yet they move with caution, for they have learned to respect the bite of our blades." Aldenor nodded grimly. The battle in the valley had indeed cost the enemy dear. Though the Free Peoples had been forced to retreat, they had not fled in panic, but had fought a skilled withdrawal, making the orcs pay for every yard of ground. The northern host was broken, but it was not destroyed, and the enemy had learned that even in defeat, the Free Peoples were dangerous foes. As the night deepened, the sound of drums grew louder, and the flickering light of countless torches could be seen moving in the darkness below. The host of Bolg the Terrible had arrived at Weathertop, and the final battle was at hand. Yet even as the defenders prepared for the assault, help came from an unexpected quarter. Through the darkness rode a small company of horsemen, their hooves striking sparks from the stones as they climbed the steep path to the tower. At their head rode a figure cloaked in gray, his face hidden beneath a deep hood, but his bearing spoke of authority and power. "Mithrandir!" cried Aldenor, recognizing the gray wizard even in the darkness. "You have come at last." Gandalf threw back his hood, revealing his weather-beaten face and gray beard. "I have come as swiftly as I could," he replied. "The roads are dark, and the enemy's spies are everywhere, but I do not come alone." He gestured to the riders who had accompanied him, and in the starlight, Aldanor could see that they were not men, but elves of the woodland realm, their armor gleaming despite the darkness. "Legolas!" Galeon cried, stepping forward to greet the elven prince. "My lord, how came you here? I thought you remained in the halls of your father." Legolas dismounted from his horse, his keen eyes surveying the ruins of Weathertop. "The darkness spreads, my friend," he said. "The necromancer's forces have broken from Dol Guldur, and they march north to join with Bolg's host. My father has sent me with what aid he can spare, but I fear it may not be enough." The news struck the defenders like a physical blow. If the forces of Dol Guldur were marching north, then the trap was even more complete than they had imagined. The Free Peoples would be caught between two armies, and their chances of survival would be vanishingly small. But Gandalf raised his staff, and its light seemed to push back the shadows. "Do not despair," he said. "The night is dark, but the dawn will come. I have sent word to Rivendell, and Lord Elrond marshals what strength he can. Help is coming, but we must hold until it arrives." As if in response to his words, the enemy's assault began. The orcs swarmed up the slopes of Weathertop like a plague of locusts, their weapons glinting in the torchlight, their voices raised in a cacophony of hate. The defenders met them with sword and axe, bow and spear, their weapons flashing in the darkness as they fought to hold the ancient watchtower. The battle raged through the night, the very stones of Weathertop running red with blood. Again and again, the orcs charged up the slopes, and again and again. They were driven back by the desperate courage of the Free Peoples, but with each assault, the defenders grew fewer, and the circle of light around the tower grew ever smaller. It was in the darkest hour before dawn that the true test came. From the massed ranks of the enemy came a roar that shook the very foundations of the tower. And through the orc lines strode Bolg the Terrible himself, his massive form towering above his minion. In his hand he bore a great mace, its head wreathed in shadow, and his yellow eyes blazed with malice as he gazed upon the defiant watchtower. "The time has come to end this farce," he snarled, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "Come down from your perch, and I will grant you a swift death. Resist, and I will make your agony legendary." But from the top of the tower came Aldanor's voice, clear and strong despite his weariness. "We are the Rangers of the North, the heirs of Isildur and the guardians of the realm. We do not yield to the likes of you, spawn of Azog. Come and take us, if you can." Bolg's roar of rage echoed across the hills, and the final assault began. Chapter 6. The Light of Arendil. The dawn came gray and cheerless over the Weather Hills, its pale light revealing the full extent of the carnage that had been wrought upon the slopes of Weathertop. The ancient watchtower was surrounded by a sea of orc bodies, their black blood staining the earth. But still the enemy pressed forward, driven by the terrible will of their master. Atop the tower, the defenders had been pressed back to the very summit. Their numbers dwindled to a handful of the most skilled and determined warriors. Aldanor stood at the center of the last circle, his sword notched and stained with battle. His gray eyes never wavering, he faced the overwhelming odds. Beside him, Thorek Ironbeard hefted his warhammer, its runes glowing with a faint light that seemed to push back the shadows. "This is a good place to die," the Dwarf Lord said, his voice carrying no fear, only a grim satisfaction. "Let our enemies remember this day, when the free peoples showed them what courage truly means." Legolas stood at the edge of the circle, his bow singing as arrow after arrow found its mark in the pressing ranks of orcs. Yet even his elvish skill could not stem the tide that swept upward, and his quiver grew light with each shot. "The light fades," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of ages, "but it does not die. Let that be our legacy." Gandalf stood at the center of the circle, his staff raised high, its light blazing like a star against the darkness. The wizard's face was stern with concentration as he held back the shadows that pressed in from all sides. But even his power had limits, and the enemy's malice was vast. It was then that Bolg the Terrible himself began to climb the tower, his massive form moving with surprising grace as he ascended the broken stone. The orcs parted before him, their voices raised in a chant of victory, for they knew that their master's presence spelled doom for the defender. "Come down, little warriors," Bolg called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Come down and face your fate. The game is ended, and you have lost." But Aldanor raised his sword, its blade catching the pale light of dawn. "We are not done yet, spawn of darkness," he declared. "While breath remains in our bodies, we shall fight on." The great orc chieftain laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Brave words, but words alone will not save you. Look around you. Where are your allies? Where are the hosts of Rivendell? You are alone, and you shall die alone." Yet even as he spoke, a new light began to shine from the east, not the pale gray of dawn, but a clear silver radiant that seemed to pierce the very heart of the darkness. The orcs cowered and shielded their eyes, for this was no earthly light, but the gleam of the Silmaril that sailed in the heaven. "Arendil!" cried Legolas, his voice filled with wonder. "The light of Arendil shines upon us. Look, the star rises in the east." Indeed, in the growing light of dawn, the morning star blazed with unusual brilliance, its radiance seeming to fall like a blessing upon the embattled watchtower. The orcs fell back, their courage failing them, for they could not bear the pure light of the Silmaril. But more than the light itself, it was what came with it that turned the tide of battle. From the east rode a great host, their banners streaming in the wind, their armor gleaming like silver in the starlight. At their head rode Elrond himself, Lord of Rivendell, his sword bright as flame, his face stern with the wrath of the Eldar. "The Grey Company!" shouted Aldenor, recognizing the banner of the Dunedain that flew among the approaching host. "The Rangers of the South have come!" Behind the elven lord rode the Knights of Rivendell, their lances bright with starfire, their voices raised in the ancient war songs of the Noldor. With them came the Rangers of the Grey Company, their faces grim beneath their weathered hoods, their swords thirsty for orc blood. The sight of the approaching host threw the enemy into confusion. Bolg roared in rage, his plans for a swift victory crumbling before his eyes. The orcs, who had been so confident of their triumph, now found themselves caught between the defenders of Weathertop and the advancing relief force. "Form ranks!" Bolg commanded, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "Meet them in the field. Do not let them reach the tower." But it was too late. The host of Rivendell struck the orc lines like a thunderbolt, their charge shattering the enemy's formation and sending them reeling back in disorder. The Knights of Rivendell rode through the orc ranks like a silver tide, their lances piercing the darkness, their battle cries echoing across the hills. From the tower, the defenders watched in amazement as the tide of battle turned. The orcs, who had seemed so numerous and invincible, now broke and fled before the righteous fury of the Eldar. Yet Bolg himself did not flee, but stood his ground, his mace raised in defiance. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled at the defender. "I am Bolg the Terrible, son of Azog, and I do not fear your pretty lights and song. I will have my revenge, if not today, then tomorrow, or the day after. The darkness will return, and when it does, you will all pay the price for your defiance." With that, the great orc chieftain leaped from the tower, his massive form disappearing into the chaos of the battle below. The defenders watched him go, knowing that this was not the end, but merely the beginning of a greater struggle. But for now, the day was won. The light of Arendil shone bright in the eastern sky, and the forces of darkness had been driven back into the shadows from whence they came. The Battle of Weathertop was over, but the war for the North had only just begun. Chapter 7. The Council of War. The Great Hall of Rivendell had never seemed so full of tension as it did in the days following the Battle of Weathertop. The assembled lords of the Free Peoples sat in council, their faces grave with the weight of the tidings they had received. Maps of the northern lands lay spread across the great table, marked with the movements of armies and the positions of the enemy's stronghold. Lord Elrond presided over the council with the wisdom of ages, his gray eyes reflecting the burden of command. At his right hand sat Gandalf the Grey, his staff resting against his chair, his weathered face creased with concern. The wizard had ridden far in the days since the battle, seeking news of the enemy's movements and the intentions of the Dark Lord. "The victory at Weathertop has bought us time," Elrond spoke, his voice carrying the authority of the Eldar. "But it has not won us the war. Bolg the Terrible has retreated to his stronghold in Mount Gundabad, and even now he gathers his forces for a renewed assault. We must act swiftly if we are to prevent him from overwhelming the north." Aldenor, his wounds still fresh from the battle, leaned forward over the map. "The enemy's strength is vast," he said. "Our scouts report that orcs pour into Mount Gundabad from all the northern strongholds. The misty mountains crawl with his servants, and the very air is thick with the smoke of their forges." Thorek Ironbeard, his war hammer resting across his knees, growled in agreement. "The spawn of Azog has learned cunning in his years of hiding. He does not merely gather orcs, but dragons as well. My kinsmen in the Grey Mountains report that cold drakes have been seen flying to his banner, and their breath brings death to all who oppose them." Legolas, who had remained silent throughout much of the council, now spoke with the clear voice of his people. "The woodland realm fights on two fronts," he said. "The necromancer's forces press us from the south, while this new threat emerges from the north. We cannot abandon our vigil against Dol Guldur, yet we cannot ignore the danger from Mount Gundabad." Gandalf raised his staff, its light gleaming in the firelight. "The two threats are not separate," he said. "The necromancer and Bolg serve the same master, though they may not know it. The Dark Lord stirs in Mordor, and his influence reaches out to all who dwell in shadow. This war in the north is but the first movement in a greater symphony of darkness. The words sent a chill through the assembled council, for if the wizard spoke true, then they faced not merely a regional conflict, but the opening moves of a war that would engulf all Middle-earth. The weight of this knowledge settled upon them like a shroud, and for a moment, the great hall was silent, save for the crackling of the flames in the hearth. It was then that a new voice spoke from the shadows of the hall. Yet there is hope, even in the darkest hour. All eyes turned to see a figure step forward from the pillared alcoves, tall and stern, clad in the gray and silver of the Dunedain, but bearing himself with the authority of ancient kings. This was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, chieftain of the Dunedain, and heir to the throne of Gondor, though few knew his true lineage. "My lord," said Aldenor, rising to bow before his chieftain, "you have come at last." Aragorn's gray eyes surveyed the council with the keen gaze of one who had walked long in the wild places of Middle-earth. "I have been tracking the enemy's movements in the far north," he said. "The tidings I bring are grim, but not without hope. Bolg's host is vast, but it is not invincible. The orcs are fractious and difficult to control, and their alliance with the dragons is uneasy at best." He moved to the great map, his finger tracing the mountain passes that led to Mount Gundabad. Here, in the Redhorn Pass, the enemy has placed his strongest defenses, but there is another way, the High Pass, which the orcs believe impassable in winter. A small force might use this route to strike at the heart of Mount Gundabad, while the main host holds the enemy's attention. Thorek leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with interest. "A dangerous gambit," he said. "The High Pass is treacherous even in summer, and in winter it becomes a death trap. But if it could be done, it would require warriors of exceptional skill and courage," Elrond said thoughtfully. "And even then, the chances of success would be small. We would be asking brave souls to undertake what might well be a suicide mission." Aragorn's jaw tightened with resolve. "The throne of Gondor may be my birthright, but the north is my home. I will lead this mission myself, if the council approves. Give me 50 of the best warriors, and I will bring fire to the very heart of Mount Gundabad. And I will go with you," declared Legolas, his voice ringing with determination. "The woodland realm has suffered long under the shadow of evil. It is time to strike back at the source of that darkness." Thorek Ironbeard rose from his seat, his war hammer gleaming in the firelight. "The dwarves have an ancient debt to settle with the spawn of Azog," he growled. "Count me among your company, son of Arathorn. My axe thirsts for orc blood, and my people's honor demands vengeance." One by one, the lords of the Free Peoples pledged their support to the desperate plan. It was a slim hope, but it was hope nonetheless, and in those dark days, even the smallest glimmer of light was precious beyond measure. As the council drew to a close, Gandalf spoke once more, his voice heavy with the weight of prophecy. "The road ahead is dark and perilous," he said. "Not all who begin this journey will see its end. But know this, the fate of the North, and perhaps of all Middle-earth, hangs in the balance. May the light of Arendil shine upon your path, and may the valor watch over you in the trials to come." The die was cast. The Free Peoples would strike at the heart of darkness itself, and the outcome would determine whether the North would remain free or fall beneath the shadow of Mount Gundabad. Chapter 8. The Path of Shadow. The wind howled through the High Pass like the voice of some ancient evil, carrying with it the bite of winter and the promise of death. Snow swirled in great drifts across the narrow path, and the very stones seemed to groan under the weight of the storm. Yet through this desolation, a small company of warriors made their way with grim determination, their forms barely visible against the white fury of the blizzard. Aragorn led the way, his keen eyes piercing the storm as he sought the hidden path that would lead them to the heart of Mount Gundabad. Behind him came the chosen few, 50 warriors picked from the finest of the Free People, each one a veteran of many battles and proven in the crucible of war. Rangers of the Dunedain marched beside elves of the woodland realm, while dwarves of the Blue Mountains trudged through the snow with the endurance of their mountain-born race. The path grows treacherous, called Legolas, his elvish eyes able to see farther through the storm than mortal sight could reach. There are crevasses ahead, hidden by the snow. We must take care, lest we lose warriors to the mountain's hunger. Thorek Ironbeard, his beard white with frost, hefted his warhammer and tested the ground ahead with its handle. "The mountain remembers," he said grimly. "These passes have drunk the blood of many who dared to challenge them. But we are not the first to walk this path, and we shall not be the last." Behind them, the company moved with the silence of shadows, their weapons wrapped against the snow, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. Among them walked Aldenor, his gray eyes alert for any sign of the enemy, his hand never straying far from his sword hilt. Beside him marched Golian of the Woodland Guard, his silver mail dulled by the storm, his bow strung and ready despite the driving snow. The path they followed was ancient beyond reckoning, cut into the living rock by the dwarves of the elder days. When they first delved into the roots of the mountains, few knew of its existence, and fewer still dared to use it, for it was said that the very stones were cursed, and that those who walked there were doomed to wander in the darkness forever. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the storm began to abate, but the cold grew ever more bitter. The air was thin and sharp, cutting the lungs like knives, and every breath was a struggle. Yet the company pressed on, driven by the knowledge that time was their enemy, as much as the orcs that waited ahead. It was then that they encountered the first sign of the enemy's presence. In a sheltered hollow beside the path, they found the remains of an orc patrol. A dozen of the creatures, their bodies frozen in the snow, their weapons scattered and broken. But these orcs had not died from the cold or the mountain's fury. They had been slain by something else, something that had torn them apart with terrible savagery. "What manner of creature could have done this?" whispered one of the rangers, his voice barely audible above the wind. Aragorn knelt beside the closest body, his experienced eye reading the signs of battle. "These wounds were not made by sword or axe," he said grimly. "Something with claws and fangs did this work. We are not alone on this mountain." As if summoned by his words, a howl echoed across the peaks. Not the cry of wolf or warg, but something far more terrible. The sound sent a chill through the company that had nothing to do with the mountain cold, and hands moved instinctively to weapons. "Wargs?" asked Thorek, his grip tightening on his warhammer. "Worse," replied Legolas, his keen hearing picking up the nuances of the cry. "Cold drakes. The lesser dragons have made their lairs in these peaks, and they hunt anything that moves. We must be on our guard." The company pressed on, their senses alert for any sign of the predators that stalked the high places. The path wound ever upward, following the spine of the mountain range, and with each step, the danger grew greater. They were entering the realm of the dragons, where death waited in the shadows, and the very air was thick with menace. As night fell, they found shelter in a cave hollowed out by some ancient cataclysm. The warriors huddled together for warmth, their weapons close at hand, their eyes watching the darkness beyond the cave mouth. No fire was lit, for the light would draw the attention of things better left undisturbed. "How much farther?" asked Galion, his voice barely above a whisper. Aragorn consulted the ancient map that had guided them thus far, its parchment yellow with age and marked with the runes of the Dunedain. "We are perhaps halfway to our goal," he replied. "Tomorrow we must cross the Dragon's Teeth, the most treacherous part of the pass. If we can survive that, we will be within striking distance of Mount Gundabad." The Dragon's Teeth were well named, for they were a series of jagged peaks that thrust up from the mountain like the fangs of some primordial beast. The path wound between them, narrow and treacherous, with drops that fell away into darkness on either side. It was here that the cold drakes made their lair, and here that many brave warriors had met their doom. As the company settled down for the night, each warrior lost in his own thoughts. None could know that they were being watched. High above, perched on a ledge that no mortal foot could reach, Yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness, and a serpentine form coiled in the shadows. The dragons had indeed taken notice of the intruders, and they prepared to defend their realm with all the fury of their ancient race. The night passed slowly, filled with the sound of wind and the distant echo of draconic roars. When dawn came, gray and cheerless, the company rose and prepared to face the most dangerous part of their journey. The dragon's teeth awaited, and with them, the guardians of the high places. Chapter 9. The Dragon's Teeth. The morning mist clung to the jagged peaks like the breath of sleeping dragons, and the narrow path that wound between the stone fangs seemed to disappear into the very heart of the mountain. The company moved in single file, their footsteps muffled by the snow, their eyes constantly scanning the heights above for any sign of movement. Here, in the realm of the cold drakes, death could strike from any direction, and even the bravest warriors felt the chill of fear in their hearts. Aragorn led the way, his sword drawn and ready, his gray eyes alert for any sign of danger. Behind him came the company, their weapons gleaming in the pale light, their faces grim with determination. They knew that this was the most perilous part of their journey, the place where legends were born and heroes fell. The path wound upward through the dragon's teeth, following a route that had been carved from the living rock by the dwarves of the elder days. On either side, the mountain fell away into abyssal depths, and the sound of their passage echoed from the stone walls like the whisper of ghosts. The very air seemed to vibrate with malice, and more than one warrior glanced nervously at the shadows that danced among the peaks. It was Legolas who first spotted the danger. His elvish eyes, keen as those of the eagles, caught the glint of scales among the rocks high above. "Dragons!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "They come from the north." The attack came with the fury of a thunderstorm. From the heights above, 3 cold drakes swept down like living nightmares, their wings beating the air with the sound of thunder, their eyes blazing with the fire of their ancient hatred. These were not the great fire drakes of old, but they were dragons nonetheless, and their breath brought death to all who stood in their path. The first dragon struck the middle of the company, its icy breath turning the very air to frost. Warriors screamed as the cold bit into their flesh, and some fell where they stood, their blood frozen in their veins. But the Free Peoples were not defenseless, and they responded with the courage that had sustained them through countless battles. Thorek Ironbeard roared a challenge in the ancient tongue of the dwarves, his war hammer blazing with runic light as he struck at the dragon's underbelly. The weapon, forged in the deeps of the Blue Mountains and blessed by the ancient smiths, bit deep into the creature's hide, and black blood sprayed across the snow. Legolas drew his bow with elvish swiftness, his arrows singing through the air to strike the dragon's eyes. The creature reared back in pain and fury, its wings beating frantically as it sought to escape the deadly hail of shafts. But the Elf Lord was relentless, and his arrows found their mark again and again. The second dragon swept low over the company, its claws raking the stone as it sought to snatch up the warriors in its talons. But Aragorn was ready, and as the beast passed overhead, he leaped upward with the grace of his people, his sword flashing in the pale light. The blade, forged in the fires of the Noldor and blessed by the light of Arendil, cut deep into the dragon's wing, and the creature crashed to the ground in a shower of stone and snow. The third dragon, seeing its companions in distress, let out a roar that shook the very mountains. It dove from the heights with the fury of a falling star, its breath turning the air to ice, its eyes blazing with the fire of its rage. But the company was ready, and they met the attack with the courage of the Free People. Galion of the Woodland Guard stood his ground as the dragon bore down upon him, his silver mail gleaming in the light, his sword raised in defiance. As the creature's claws reached for him, he struck with all the skill of his people, his blade finding the gap in the dragon's armor and piercing its heart. The beast fell with a crash that echoed through the peaks, its lifeblood staining the snow. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had begun, but the cost had been terrible. 7 of the company lay dead, their bodies frozen by the dragon's breath, their weapons scattered in the snow. The survivors gathered around their fallen comrade, their faces grim with grief and anger. "We cannot tarry here," said Aragorn, his voice heavy with sorrow. "The dragon's roars will have alerted every creature in the mountains. We must reach Mount Gundabad before the enemy can organize a pursuit." The company gathered their gear and pressed on, leaving their fallen comrade to the mercy of the mountain. It was a bitter moment, for each of the dead had been a friend and a brother in arms, but they knew that their sacrifice would not be in vain if the mission succeeded. As they climbed higher into the peaks, the path began to descend toward the hidden valley where Mount Gundabad reared its ancient head. The fortress of the orcs lay before them, its towers black against the sky, its walls crawling with the servants of darkness. The final phase of their journey was about to begin, but even as they prepared for the assault, none of them could know that they were walking into a trap. High in the towers of Mount Gundabad, Bolg the Terrible watched their approach with eyes that blazed with malice. The orc chieftain had known of their coming from the moment they entered the high pass, and he had prepared a welcome that would make their deaths legendary. The company pressed on, their hearts heavy with the loss of their comrade, their minds focused on the task ahead. The final battle was about to begin, and the fate of the North hung in the balance. Chapter 10. The Heart of Darkness. The ancient fortress of Mount Gundabad loomed before them like a monument to evil, its black walls rising from the mountain's roots like the fangs of some primordial beast. The very stones seemed to pulse with malice, and the air was thick with the stench of orc forges and the smoke of burning. From the great gates poured streams of the enemy, their weapons glinting in the firelight, their voices raised in songs of hatred and war. Aragorn crouched behind a boulder at the edge of the hidden valley, his keen eyes surveying the fortress that had been the bane of the North for countless centuries. Beside him, the remnants of the company waited in grim silence, their faces etched with the lines of weariness and loss. They had come far and suffered much, but their greatest trial still lay ahead. "The walls are strong," whispered Thorak Ironbeard, his experienced eye reading the defenses with the skill of one who had spent a lifetime studying the art of war. "But they were built by my people in the elder days, and I know their weaknesses. There, where the north wall meets the tower, the stones are older there, and the mortar has cracked with age." Legolas nodded, his elvish sight able to pierce the shadows that cloaked the fortress. "The guards are numerous, but they are not alert. They believe themselves safe in their mountain stronghold, and they have grown complacent. We might reach the wall undetected if we move with care." But even as they planned their assault, the sound of horns echoed from the valley below, and the great gates of Mount Gundabad began to open with a grinding of ancient metal. From the depths of the fortress came a host that darkened the sky, orcs beyond counting, their armor black as night, their weapons hungry for blood. At their head rode Bolg the Terrible himself, his massive form towering above his minion, his yellow eyes blazing with the fire of his ancient hatred. "They know we are here," said Aldenor grimly. "This is no coincidence. We have been betrayed, or our approach has been discovered. Either way, the element of surprise is lost." Aragorn's jaw tightened with resolve. "Then we must change our plan. If we cannot take the fortress by stealth, we must find another way. The mission is too important to abandon now." It was then that an unexpected voice spoke from the shadows behind them. "Perhaps there is another way." The company spun around, weapons drawn, to see a figure emerge from the rocks. An old man, bent with age, his beard white as snow, his eyes twinkling with hidden knowledge. "Radagast?" said Legolas in surprise. "What are you doing here? I thought you remained in the depths of Mirkwood." The brown wizard smiled sadly. "The forest is dying, my friend. The shadow spreads from both north and south, and the very trees cry out in pain. I have come to strike at the source of this evil, for if Mount Gundabad falls, then perhaps the darkness will begin to recede." He gestured toward the fortress, and his voice took on a tone of ancient authority. "There are passages beneath the mountain that even Bolg does not know. ancient tunnels carved by the dwarves when they first delved into the depths. I can guide you through them, but the way is perilous, and not all who enter will emerge." Thorek leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. "The old ways? But they were sealed long ago, after the dragons came. The passages are said to be haunted by the spirits of those who died in the deep places." "Haunted they may be," replied Radagast, "but they are our only hope. The surface approaches are too well guarded, and the enemy expects us to attack from without. But if we can reach the heart of the mountain, we might strike at Bolg himself before he can rally his forces." Aragorn considered the proposal, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. The mission had already cost them dear, and the chances of success grew slimmer with each passing moment. But the alternative was to abandon the quest, retreat, leaving the north to face the enemy's wrath alone. "Lead on," he said finally. "We have come too far to turn back now." Radagast nodded and led them to a hidden cleft in the mountainside, concealed by fallen rocks and twisted vegetation. The entrance was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for a man to pass through, and the air that flowed from it was cold and stale, carrying with it the scent of ancient death. One by one, the company entered the passage, their torches casting dancing shadows on the wall. The tunnel led downward into the very heart of the mountain, following a route that had been carved by dwarven hands in the days when the world was young. The walls were covered with ancient runes, their meaning lost to time, and the floor was worn smooth by the passage of countless feet. As they descended deeper into the mountain, the air grew ever colder, and strange sounds echoed from the darkness ahead. The company moved with weapons drawn, their nerves taut with tension, for they knew that they were entering a realm where the living were not welcome. It was then that they encountered the first of the Guardians. From the shadows ahead came a low moaning, and the temperature in the tunnel dropped until their breath missed in the air. The company halted, their hearts pounding with sudden fear, for they recognized the sound of the restless dead. "Wraiths," whispered Radagast, his voice barely audible, "the spirits of those who died in the deep places. They do not rest easy, and they will not suffer the living to pass without a challenge." The spirits materialized from the darkness like wisps of smoke, their forms barely visible in the torchlight, their eyes glowing with the pale fire of the grave. They moved with the silence of the dead, their presence bringing with it a chill that froze the very soul. But the company did not falter. They had come too far and suffered too much to be turned back by the guardians of the past. With weapons raised and hearts steeled against fear, they pressed forward into the darkness, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them in the depths of Mount Gundabad. The final confrontation was at hand, and the fate of the North would be decided in the ancient halls beneath the mountain. Chapter 11. The Throne of Shadows. The great chamber deep within Mount Gundabad had not seen light for countless centuries, its vast expanse shrouded in perpetual darkness, save for the flickering glow of torches set in ancient sconces. The hall was vast beyond measure, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls carved with the likeness of dragons and demons that seemed to writhe and twist in the dancing firelight. At the far end of the chamber, upon a throne carved from black stone, sat a figure that chilled the blood of all who beheld it. This was not Bolg the Terrible, though his presence could be felt in the very air of the chamber. This was something far older and more terrible, a shadow given form, a darkness that had slumbered in the depths of the mountain since the elder days. As the company emerged from the tunnels, their torches casting wavering circles of light in the vast darkness, they found themselves face to face with the true master of Mount Gundabad. "Welcome, little warriors," the figure spoke, its voice echoing from the walls like the sound of grinding stone. "I have been waiting for you. Did you think your approach went unnoticed? Did you believe that your pitiful schemes could escape the attention of one who has watched the rise and fall of kingdoms?" The shadow on the throne stirred, and the company saw that it was not flesh and blood, but something far more terrible, a wraith of the ancient world, one of the nine who had once been kings of men but had been enslaved by the power of the ring. This was the Witch King of Angmar, the Lord of the Nazgul, whose very presence brought despair to the hearts of the living. "You!" gasped Aragorn, his sword trembling in his hand. "But you were defeated at the Battle of Fornost. Your kingdom fell, and your power was broken." The Witch King laughed, a sound like the screaming of the damned. "Broken? Nay, son of Isildur, merely hidden. I withdrew to the depths of this mountain to await the return of my master, and here I have gathered the servants of darkness to my banner. Bolg the Terrible is but my lieutenant, and his host serves my will." The revelation struck the company like a physical blow. They had expected to find an orc chieftain, dangerous but mortal. Instead, they faced one of the most terrible servants of the Dark Lord, a being whose very presence sapped the strength from their limbs and the courage from their hearts. "Now you understand the true nature of your quest," the Witch King continued, his voice dripping with malice. "You have not come to destroy a mere orc stronghold, but to challenge the very foundations of darkness itself. And you have failed, as all who oppose the shadow must fail." But even as despair threatened to overwhelm them, a new voice spoke from the shadows of the chamber. "Not all who oppose the shadow fail, servant of Mordor." From the darkness stepped a figure clad in white, his staff blazing with the light of the stars, his face stern with the wrath of the Valar. It was Gandalf the White, no longer the Grey Pilgrim, but transformed into something far more terrible and beautiful. "Mithrandir!" cried Legolas, his heart leaping with sudden hope. "You have come!" The wizard raised his staff, and the light that blazed from it drove back the shadows of the chamber, revealing the true extent of the hall and the horror that filled it. The walls were lined with the servants of darkness, orcs and wargs, trolls and goblins, all cowering before the radiance of the Istari. "I have come to finish what was begun long ago," Gandalf declared, his voice ringing with authority. "The time of hiding is over, Lord of the Nazgul. Your reign of terror ends here." The Witch King rose from his throne, his form swelling with shadow and malice. "You cannot defeat me, Gandalf the Fool. I am deathless, and my power is beyond your comprehension. I am the shadow that falls across the world, the darkness that devours the light." But Gandalf stood firm, his staff blazing ever brighter. "You are a servant, nothing more. Your power comes from your master, and without him, you are but a shade of your former self. The time of the Nazgul is ending, and the age of the free peoples begins." The battle that followed was like nothing the company had ever witnessed. The Witch King and Gandalf clashed in the center of the chamber, their powers meeting with a sound like thunder. Light and shadow swirled around them, and the very stones of the mountain groaned under the strain of their conflict. The company fought their way through the ranks of orcs and goblins, their weapons flashing in the light of Gandalf's staff. Aragorn's sword sang as it cut through the enemy ranks, while Legolas's arrows found their marks with deadly precision. Thorek's warhammer crushed orc skulls like eggshells, and the dwarves fought with the fury of their ancient race. But even as they battled, the true conflict raged between the wizard and the Wraith Lord. The Witch King's power was vast, drawing strength from the darkness of the mountain and the malice of his servant. But Gandalf's light was pure and unwavering, fed by the very source of creation itself. In the end, it was not strength that decided the battle, but sacrifice. As the Witch King raised his Morgul blade to strike a killing blow, Gandalf cast aside his staff and grasped the weapon with his bare hand. The blade burned like ice, and the wizard's cry of pain echoed through the chamber. "For the light!" he cried, and his sacrifice was not in vain. The pure light of the Istari flowed through the Morgul blade, turning the weapon of darkness into an instrument of justice. The Witch King screamed as his own weapon destroyed him, his form dissolving into shadow and smoke. With the fall of their master, the servants of darkness fled in terror, their courage broken and their purpose shattered. The company stood victorious in the great chamber, but the cost had been terrible. Gandalf lay still upon the stone floor, his white robes stained with blood, his staff dark and cold beside him. "Is he?" whispered Legolas, his voice breaking with grief. But even as they mourned, the wizard's eyes opened. and he smiled with the wisdom of the Valar. Not yet, my friends, not yet. The task is complete, but the greater war is yet to come. The north is free, but the shadow still stirs in the south. Go now, and carry word of what has transpired here. The free peoples must prepare for the final battle. The company gathered their wounded and began the long journey back to the surface, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The war in the north was over, but the War of the Ring was about to begin. Chapter 12. The Dawn of Hope. The great horn of Helm's Deep echoed across the northern lands, its voice carrying the news of victory to every corner of the realm. From the Misty Mountains to the Blue Mountains, from the borders of Mirkwood to the shores of the Sea of Rhûn, the free peoples heard the call and lifted their voices in songs of triumph. The shadow of Mount Gundabad had been lifted, and the north was free once more. In the halls of Rivendell, Lord Elrond stood upon the great terrace, his gray eyes gazing northward toward the distant peaks where so much blood had been spilled. The news of the victory had reached him swift as the wind, carried by the eagles of Manwë who had witnessed the final battle in the depths of the mountain. Yet even in triumph, his heart was heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. The first shadow has been lifted, he murmured to himself, but the greater darkness still gathers in the south. Sauron stirs in Mordor, and the final war approaches. At his side stood Gandalf the White, his staff gleaming in the morning light, his face serene despite the trials he had endured. The wizard had been brought to Rivendell by the Eagle, his wounds tended by the skill of the Eldar, his strength slowly returning with each passing day. The north is secure, Gandalf said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. But you speak truly, Elrond. The Nazgûl are abroad once more, and the One Ring has been found. The final test of the free people's approaches, and we must be ready. In the halls of the woodland realm, Thranduil, the Elven King, sat upon his throne of carved wood, his keen eyes reflecting the firelight as he listened to the reports of his scouts. The victory at Mount Gundabad had been complete, but the necromancer's forces still pressed upon his borders from the south. The war was far from over, and the elves of Mirkwood would need all their strength for the battles to come. The darkness recedes from the north, reported Legolas, who had returned from his quest with honor and glory, but it grows stronger in the south. The spiders of Mirkwood grow bold, and the very trees whisper of approaching doom. Thranduil nodded gravely. Then we must prepare for the final storm. The long watch of the Eldar is not yet ended, and we shall not yield while any hope remains. In the Blue Mountains, the dwarves celebrated their victory with songs that echoed through the deep halls. Thorek Ironbeard sat at the head of the great table, his war hammer resting beside him, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a debt well paid. The ancient grudge against the spawn of Azog had been settled at last, and the honor of Durin's folk had been restored. The orc spawn learned to fear the axes of the dwarf, he declared, raising his goblet high. Let all who would threaten the free people remember this day, and know that the children of Aule do not forget their debts. But even as the dwarves celebrated, messengers arrived from the south, bearing tidings that sobered their joy. The forces of Mordor were on the march, and the final battle for Middle-earth was about to begin. The war in the north had been but a prelude to the greater conflict that was to come. In the ruins of Fornost, Aragorn stood where kings had once held court, his weathered face turned toward the south. The victory at Mount Gundabad had been complete, but the Rangers of the North knew that their greatest test still lay ahead. The Dark Lord was stirring, and the heir of Isildur would soon be called upon to claim his birthright. The North is free, he said to Aldenor, who stood beside him in the ruins of the ancient throne room. But the South burns with the fires of war. The time of the Rangers is ending, and the time of the King is about to begin. Aldenor nodded, his gray eyes reflecting the wisdom of one who had walked long in the wild. The Dunedain are ready, my lord. When the call comes, we shall answer. The realm of Gondor shall not fall while the Star of the North endures. As the seasons turned and the year grew toward its end, the survivors of the Northern War scattered to their homes, carrying with them the memory of what they had accomplished and the knowledge of what was to come. The victory at Mount Gundabad had been bought with blood and sacrifice, but it had shown the free peoples that the darkness could be defeated, that even the mightiest servants of the shadow could fall before the courage of the righteous. Radagast the Brown returned to his halls in Mirkwood, his heart heavy with the knowledge of the trials that lay ahead. The forest was still sick with the poison of Dol Guldur, but the victory in the north had shown that healing was possible. The Brown Wizard would tend to his woodland realm, preparing it for the final battle against the darkness. And in the depths of Mount Gundabad, where the throne of shadows had stood for so long, new life began to stir. The ancient hall, cleansed by the light of the Astari, echoed no longer with the songs of hatred and war, but with the sound of hammers on anvils as the dwarves began the long work of reclaiming their ancestral home. The mountain that had been a fortress of evil would become once more a beacon of hope in the north. Yet even as the free peoples celebrated their victory, the wise among them knew that this was but the first movement in a greater symphony of conflict. Far to the south, in the fires of Mount Doom, the Dark Lord Sauron forged his plans for the conquest of all Middle-earth. The War of the Ring was coming, and the fate of the world would be decided in the battles yet to come. But for now, in this moment of triumph, the North was free. The shadow of Mount Gundabad had been lifted, the servants of darkness had been scattered, and the free peoples had shown that courage and sacrifice could triumph over even the mightiest evil. The light of hope burned bright in the northern lands, and it would not easily be extinguished. In the halls of Rivendell, as the last council of the wise drew to a close, Elrond spoke words that would be remembered long after the battles were won and the darkness had passed away forever. "Let this victory be a beacon to all who dwell in Middle-earth," he said, his voice carrying the weight of ages. "The darkness may be vast, but it is not eternal. The light endures, and while courage remains in the hearts of the free peoples, hope shall never die." And so ended the war in the north, with victory hard won and hope renewed. The greater trials that lay ahead would test the free peoples as they had never been tested before, but they would face them with the knowledge that even the mightiest darkness could be overcome by the united strength of those who fought for the light. The dawn of hope had come to the north, and its radiance would shine forth to kindle the fires of resistance in every corner of Middle-earth. The final battle was yet to come, but the free peoples would meet it with courage undaunted and hope unbroken, for they had learned the greatest truth of all, that light is stronger than darkness, and love is more powerful than hate. In the end, that would be enough.